You already know the answer to this question. It's about graphics and production values. Games need to look and feel like real life now, and that takes time. That must be the answer, right? Well, what if I told you that's not the answer? What if there is a completely different cause behind all these extended development timelines? Because things didn't used to be this way, and I'm not talking about the 90s or the 2000s here. Even 10 years ago, games looked and played just as well as they do today, if not better, yet were released by studios at a much quicker cadence. And not just games, mind you, but seemingly all entertainment. It's almost difficult to find a discussion about the next season of Severance or The Last of Us that doesn't include buckets of frustration over how long everything takes to make nowadays. So let's debunk this point first. This is a natural assumption, since games cost significantly more to make now. The $300 million price tag for Spider-Man 2 is a direct result of the number of cutscenes, animations, set pieces, and assets made for the game, alongside the fact that it was made in California. And yet, despite all that splendor, it was only in production for a little over 2.5 years, according to the Insomniac leak in 2023. Because despite being made in a financially irresponsible way, the actual production cycle was quite, well, productive. They, unlike most studios these days, didn't meander for multiple years. In fact, many efficient AAA studios make use of surprisingly short production cycles, usually shorter than 2 years. That's how a studio like Remedy is able to make its games so efficiently. It only allocates the majority of the studio's resources when it's actually go time, when there is a very clear plan for what to do. With a good pipeline, even the most asset-intensive games can be made quite quickly if you have the proper resources. So when you see games like these take the greater part of a decade to make, that's rarely because they actually require that much time. They're just fundamentally mismanaged. The problem rarely lies in graphics, production values, or the fact that crunch is no longer acceptable. The problem actually lies in two specific places. Let's take the second point first. In times like these, when developers are laid off left and right, if not crunched into oblivion, it's bold to suggest that more external pressure would be a good thing. But here's the thing, sooner or later, that pressure is going to arrive. If it's not there by year 2, it will certainly be there by year 5. And that leads to something many developers are familiar with. The final year of a project is significantly more productive than every year that came before. And that's even if you remove crunch from the equation. In fact, I don't think 12-hour workdays are what gets things done. There's no scientific evidence that points to that. No, what makes the final year so exceptional for most projects is that the developers know exactly what they need to do and when they need to get it done. They also know that their efforts will materialize into a finished product in the not too distant future. It is these factors that allow studios to excel. Unfortunately, for most teams, that's reserved for the final year, with the half-decade leading up to it being substantially less productive.
Historically, we've done very poorly at being efficient without the pressure of an external deadline.
The first trailer was coming online, and that forced us to define the look of our game, define the location of where the game takes place, define Ellie's look and her age and her hair and her outfit. We're forced to make those choices. We can't just keep iterating because there's a deadline.
This reinforces a suspicion I've had for a long time. Even the best AAA studios tend to meander, sinking enormous amounts of time into analysis, iteration, and experimentation. The rise of extensive focus testing only seems to make this worse, pushing developers to weigh every possible alternative and endlessly refine the smallest details before finally committing to a direction. Look at Metroid Prime 4. A studio that had spent the previous decade making 2D platformers was handed the project by a publisher that seemingly didn't know what to do with it. A lot of factors contributed to Prime 4 taking 7 years, even after its reboot. But one of the biggest was the obvious dissonance between the studio, the publisher, and the franchise itself. And where does that lead? To huge amounts of time spent simply trying to figure out what the game is supposed to be, with years lost to creative drift. What's even more striking is that all those years of development appear to have produced a game that either feels almost identical to its 20-year-old predecessors, or like a watered-down version of already exhausted AAA trends. I've never seen years of iteration turn out to be a real advantage for a project. If anything, it usually reveals the opposite, that there was never a strong guiding vision, and no shared culture among the people making it that could sustain one. That's exactly what causes the other issue, the hierarchy of approval. This is what happens when you, as a director, either 1, don't trust the people below you to understand your vision, or 2, don't really have a vision at all. So you schedule meetings. Plenty of them, in fact, filled with people who cost hundreds of dollars an hour and who could be spending those hours doing much more important things, like actually making the game.
I think this video from Second Wind explains it all quite well.
In order to make even a minor adjustment, a barrage of meetings between different departments has to take place. What's funny about this revelation is how obvious it is when you think about it. Of course things are being done this way, because otherwise the AAA space wouldn't be as fundamentally uncreative and unproductive as it is. Remember, these meetings are often not actually about discussing strategy, but rather about getting things approved. The hierarchy of approval is what makes these studios move in slow motion. Because when everything needs to be approved, you often run into gridlock, where a certain developer can't move forward until they've obtained that approval. Culturally, creatively, and financially, it's a nightmare. And yet, no one bats an eye at it, because the alternative is seen as much riskier. Actually flattening the structure to give individuals the opportunity to commit is seen as an extremely risky strategy, because every commitment has some form of opportunity cost attached to it. Every time you make a firm decision to go down one path, you close off another. I get that you don't want to get it wrong, of course, but I think the risks associated with meandering and moving cautiously are significantly greater. It's just that those risks are indirect, so they're not nearly as psychologically taxing as the direct ones. Now, what about a game like Knight Silksong? 7 years in the oven, and it turned out great. It was also described by the developers as development heaven, and they said that the excessive development time ended up working in favor of the project. That's fair enough, since they were making something truly unique and special. The thing is, though, that 95% of all AAA developers aren't making anything unique or special. In fact, the 2020s have been defined by great studios taking an excessive amount of time to make something surprisingly cookie-cutter. Most studios inside PlayStation, Ubisoft, Xbox, and Bethesda follow very defined templates that were created a long time ago. Good or bad, most of the games they make are undeniably familiar. As high quality as a game like Ghost of Yotei is, its risk-averse structure really highlights how uninterested the industry is in forward momentum. It works, of course, but it's far from optimal. Projects like these, as impressive as they are in their execution, feel less like strong creative forces and more like 5-year-long paint-by-numbers exercises. And let me be clear here, I don't just think that extended development timelines introduce diminishing returns. I actually believe they can stifle the creativity that needs to be there in order to fuel a project's potential success. In other words, drawn-out development schedules can often lead to the game being even worse. Great art often comes from decisiveness and momentum, not from overanalyzing every little detail until you've sanded down every edge. That's why the Beatles usually spent a few months making an album, put it out, and moved on. They didn't feel the constant need to analyze whether every track was exactly as perfect as it could have been, because they trusted both their instincts and their ability to iterate between albums instead of during them.
I just sort of said, well, look, why not Abbey Road? Because if we did that, we could just run outside. Right. There's a level crossing, as we call it out there, zebra crossing. And we could just stand there, we could get photographed, come back to work. It'd take 2 seconds.
Right. Isn't it weird how just a simple thought like that becomes a legend? I mean, that's like iconic now, Abbey Road.
Yeah. This is also what FromSoftware did during the 13-year period in which they made Dark Souls 1, 2, 3, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring. Do you think they were scheduling meetings every time something needed to be added or changed? Of course not. Instead, Miyazaki had a very distinct and personal philosophy for how he wanted his games to be, and he was able to effectively instill that philosophy in his developers. And that's another perk of moving faster. When you commit to making something in 2 or 3 years, you don't have to carry the burden that comes with the expectations of a long wait. Uncharted 3 was clearly a bit disjointed, but it was only made in 2 years, so it didn't have to be revolutionary or perfect. The cost of imperfection was lower because the studio was still in motion. Once you start excessively overanalyzing every detail over the course of a project, outside expectations rise too. So what do? You spend even more time trying to meet those raised expectations. Slower production creates higher stakes, and higher stakes creates slower production. This is the exact cycle we witnessed with Tears of the Kingdom, an undeniably great game that absolutely should not have taken 6 years to make. What many people forget is that the reason it needed an entire additional year of polish was because the game had already taken so many years to make. So what's one more? Because if it underdelivered, they would once again need another 5 or 6 years to redeem themselves with a new project. You could also tell that, due to the long wait, people were significantly less forgiving of all the recycled content from Breath of the Wild. And it's a reasonable complaint. If you already had the map, art style, combat system, and many of the assets and animations in place on day one, how long would Tears of the Kingdom have taken if it had been made from scratch? 10 years? It really stresses the need for external pressure on these projects. A lot of what we now remember as confidence was mainly just necessity. Look at Breaking Bad, Mad Men, The Sopranos. All of these were forced into a 1-year schedule, which meant that strong creative work had to be delivered decisively. Is it a coincidence that the most time-pressured shows ended up being the most creatively successful? Or maybe that yearly cadence is what keeps you from losing your footing and allows you to focus on the things that actually matter. For these shows, the core of it was always the writing and performances. Everything else was really just supplementary. Gilligan's new show, Pluribus, is what happens when you lose that focus. The timeline is now 3 years per season instead of 1, and that means set pieces, overly detailed sets, and major location changes all get added into the equation, resulting in a show that's somehow more detailed yet less inspired than its two predecessors. I will say though that in select, very special cases, all those minor details really do matter. In the case of GTA 6, they might just be what matters most. For a project like that, the main selling point is that every little detail is cared for. I still think it's fascinating that we get to experience things like that every once in a while. It's just that most projects are not GTA 6, yet they're being made as if they are. This might sound antithetical to the creative process, of course. We've collectively agreed on the notion that quality and quantity are mutually exclusive, that you trade one for the other. But I don't believe that at all. For almost every publisher, the past decade has been an experiment in whether sharp deadlines make a project better or worse. I think at this point, we've been shown that an excessive amount of development time can be just as much of a liability as an asset. Perhaps great art comes from decisiveness, momentum, and strong instincts, not from exhausting every possible alternative. I guess the real question is what outcome we're actually after. For me at least, it's never been clearer. If all those extra hours aren't reflected in the work itself, then maybe the problem was never really about time in the first place.